Thanks very much. Yeah, so I'd like to start off by thanking Farming Smarter just for inviting me to come talk about kochia. Kochia is my favorite weed, and we grow it very well, so especially in this area. So anyway, I'm going to be focusing mainly on kochia. We have a few demos that we're going to be going through here. You'll notice that the demos are sort of FMC centric. I'm an AAFC research scientist, so I'm not associated with FMC in any way, but it just so happens that these demos are here and they tell a pretty good story, so we're going to go through that as well. Okay. So the first one, we'll start off back there, but just the biology of kochia to start off with. So first of all, kochia, I mean, it's obviously one of the most problematic weeds that we have here in southern Alberta. And kochia is it's a C4 species, so it grows very well in heat and also in drought conditions, obviously, which is why it does so well here in southern Alberta. So you'll notice, especially in years where we have warm and dry conditions, that's really where kochia starts to take off. And of course, we've had several of those years in the recent past, right? Which is why I think kochia is becoming an increasing issue for many farmers in the region. Okay, so biology, I mentioned kochia is a C4 species. There's also a few unique things about kochia that set it apart from different weeds, but also contribute to why kochia has such a large selection pressure for resistance. And so kochia, first of all, has a relatively short-lived seed bank. So this seed is essentially non-dormant, or it has very little dormancy. So when seed goes into the soil seed bank, it generally only persists for about 1 to 2 years. And that means that we can actually target that as with some of our management practices. So we'll talk about mostly pre-plant herbicides in the demos, but also go beyond that a little bit and talk about how to exploit that short-lived seed bank persistence. Okay. The other thing about short-lived seed bank persistence is that it also contributes to rapid population turnover, and rapid population turnover means large selection pressure for herbicide resistance, unfortunately. Right. So basically, having a large proportion of that population exposed to the herbicides that we're applying each year. And then when you combine that with the ability for kochia to outcross with other individuals of the same species relatively well, that creates almost a perfect storm for resistance, right? So kochia has a unique type of flowering that's called protogynous flowering. And what that means is that there's almost 2 stages to its flowering on an individual plant. First of all, when it starts to flower, it's actually it can't self-pollinate itself off the start. So it has to rely on pollen from neighboring plants, right? And along with that pollen comes transfer of herbicide resistance traits. So there's this initial period of forced outcrossing, but then essentially the male part of the flower begins to mature on the plant, and it can essentially finish off its own pollination through self-pollination, allowing it to set essentially as many seeds as possible in that particular growing season.
Hey Charles, what was that called again? What?
Protogynous flowering.
You got that, Alexi? Yep. Protogynous.
There you go.
Awesome.
You learn something new every day.
Okay, thank you.
So that is essentially why we see such a rapid spread of herbicide resistance traits in kochia. And you combine that with efficient pollen, what we call, or efficient seed-mediated gene flow, because it's a tumbleweed. It can spread itself through multiple fields in a single year, tumbling from field to field, right? So we have efficient seed and pollen-mediated gene flow, resulting in rapid spread of resistance. With kochia, I'll talk a little bit about the resistance story, and then that'll tie into some of the demos that we have here. So for resistance in Canada, in particular the Canadian prairies, we initially observed group 2 resistance, or ALS inhibitor resistance, in the late 80s, 88 and 89, across the prairies. And over the course of about 2 decades, group 2 resistance spread through essentially all kochia populations. to the point where we don't even test for group 2 resistance anymore. It's just safe to assume that all kochia is group 2 resistant. And we even have trouble finding susceptible populations to group 2 herbicides. Then in 2011, kochia was the first weed in Western Canada to develop glyphosate resistance. And the subsequent survey in 2012, so this was initially documented in southern Alberta in Warner County, in Canada anyway. And in 2012, the survey documented that about 5% of the populations in the region were resistant to glyphosate or had individuals that were resistant to glyphosate. That survey was repeated in 2017, 5 years later, which showed that at that point 50% of the populations had glyphosate resistance. So that's just kind of an indication of how rapidly resistance can spread through kochia populations because of that pollen and seed mediated gene flow. Right? We've actually just, we're currently working on the 2021 survey for kochia in southern Alberta, and we've completed the glyphosate screening showing roughly in the about 80% of populations have individuals that are resistant to glyphosate. That doesn't mean that all of the individuals in the population are resistant at that point, but it does mean that there are resistant individuals present, and over the course of recurrent selection pressure, you'll see that resistance increase in the population, right? So
Just glyphosate or group 2?
we're talking just glyphosate. As far as group 2, it's safe to assume all kochia is group 2 resistant.
So what about authority, or how soon are we going to resist authority?
That's a really good question. And so when we're talking about glyphosate resistance, and now the majority of populations being glyphosate resistant, that creates concern for some of the other modes of action that are still effective for kochia management, right? And we see a lot with our pre-plant burn down or pre-emergence herbicides that we're relying heavily on that group 14, right? Talking about authority and other group 14s like saflufenicil, carfentrazone, for example. With those burn down herbicides and pre-plant herbicides, we're essentially just adding that additional effective mode of action in. But if we have glyphosate resistance, that's still only selection pressure to the individual mode of action, right? We're not using multiple modes of action in that case, right? So that's something to consider. And it's something that's on our radar. We've been screening for group 14 resistance throughout these kochia surveys that we've been doing. And so far, it looks like if it is present, it's very small, but we don't have the data to say that we have group 14 resistance in kochia.
Good, keep it that way.
Yeah, so we're hoping to keep it that way anyway. So that is good news, and that'll also show up in some of these demos that we go through. Before we look at that, though, the synthetic auxin resistance in kochia is another concern that we have on the prairies here. So when I'm talking about synthetic auxin resistance, mainly to dicamba and fluroxapyr. And so we've documented both of those biotypes across the prairies. And sitting, I would say, roughly in sort of the 20 to 30% of populations at current. But that's a pretty rough estimate based on surveys that take place across the prairies. And the other thing to note with synthetic auxin resistance, so here we're talking about herbicides that we're commonly using in small grain cereal crops that tend to have, or that do have efficacy on kochia, right? The one thing that we've been finding with synthetic auxins is that it's actually less common to find resistance to both dicamba and fluroxapyr in the same population. We frequently document resistance to either dicamba or fluroxapyr, but with both of them was about 4% of the populations that we had tested in Alberta in 2017, compared with 18% for dicamba resistance and 13% for fluroxapyr resistance at that time. So there might still be some management tools there if we're talking about not having broad cross resistance to all the synthetic auxins. And with that, so let's go into some of these demos here, and we'll talk a little bit about herbicide options, and then I'll try and tie that into cultural management as well. So we're going to start off at the back here.
So is there a similar timeline between when you first noticed resistance to getting to that 80%? Is it like the same?
Yeah, it's so essentially the timeline of resistance. I would say with glyphosate resistance, we're seeing basically similar to what we saw with group 2s, right? Where over the course of about 2 decades, you're going to see it throughout all kochia populations.
Fluroxypyr and dicamba is
Fluroxypyr and dicamba, it's still unsure. So if anything, I think it would be slower for those. And the reasoning, so actually dicamba resistance was documented in the States, in Montana in 1994 in kochia. And it's still not to the level of group 2 or glyphosate resistance, right? So it seems to be spreading slower in the States anyway. But we are seeing, as I mentioned, sort of roughly the 20-30% of populations here in Western Canada. We don't know if it's going to spread quicker here than in the States, or it will remain sort of a slow spread throughout populations. Yes?
Thank you. So looking at the current development of herbicide resistance for kochia, it seems what basically we are currently trying to solve, we are providing symptoms and not solution. What are the long-term solutions that we need to think about to be able to solve this whole, let me call it pandemic?
Yeah, so I mean, that's an excellent question, and I mean, essentially one of the broad questions of my research program is sort of how do we get a handle on kochia when we're seeing this rapid development of resistance, right? So I think that part of it, at least in my mind, it comes with sort of integrating the remaining tools that we have left in herbicides with cultural management. And so once we go through these demos, I'll talk a little bit more about some of the cultural management research that we're doing, but we just don't have on display right here. Okay?
I would love to see those particular.
Sure, they're just down the road.
How many types of kochia or tumbleweed are there?
So as far as types, it kind of depends on how you define types. As far as,
Biotypes?
yeah, so biotypes, you can basically have a combination. When I'm talking about a biotype, it means that there's something unique genetically, right? So especially when it comes to herbicide resistance, a different biotype would be stacking of these different herbicide traits together in any combination, right? So if you think we have group 2 resistance, group 4 resistance, and group 9 resistance, and any combination of those as well would be a different biotype. When we're talking about phenotypes in the field though, you can see a whole range. Like if you look in an individual field, kochia plants can look completely different, even in like a meter squared, right? And that is because kochia is just so heavily genetically diverse that we have just as much diversity in a single field as you have among fields, say here in southern Alberta and then southern Manitoba.
15, 20, 25 types? What do you think?
It's hard to say. Again, it comes back to how you define that type. But for biotypes, we'd be talking roughly about 9-ish, right? If we're talking about herbicide resistance biotypes. When you're talking about phenotypes, it can, I don't even know what the number would be, because every year I seem to find a new kochia plant that looks completely different than its neighbor. So this trial behind me here is looking at burn down applications, right? So there's a few select burn down applications here. We'll start off. You can see them all labeled at the front, but I encourage you just to kind of walk down and sort of choose which one is your favorite, and then we can talk about that a little bit. One thing to note here is that there is no crop, right? So essentially the burn down applications were applied in the spring, and then the kochia is just allowed to grow. There's also other weeds in there as well, but kochia is essentially the dominant species here. Okay, so just take a gander through the plots here, and we can talk a little bit about it.
Is none a choice?
It's not a good choice.
Of all these treatments, for me, none would be the choice.
Yeah, so I mean, the big thing to note here is that we're talking about the absence of what we call interspecific competition, meaning there's no crop, right? With herbicides, it's actually surprising how much efficacy from the herbicide comes from the interaction of that herbicide with the ability for the crop to compete with the weed.
The glyphosate looked like the untreated check.
Yeah, it's clearly there's glyphosate resistance here.
There's the winner.
This is the winner here, I think.
Yes, I would have to agree here.
That's 4 groups here, right?
Yeah, so there's in Truvix, there's tribenuron, which is a group 2, dicamba, which is a group 4, carfentrazone, which is a group 14, and then glyphosate, which is a group 9. So there's 4 groups there together. When we're looking at these plots, you'll see, first of all, without focusing on any particular herbicide, in the center there's sort of an area of suppressed kochia. That's actually not related to the herbicide in my opinion. What you're seeing there is kochia autotoxicity. So some of you may have heard of autotoxicity in crops like alfalfa, for example, which essentially, if you leave it there long enough, it manages itself. You see the same thing in kochia. If it's present at high densities in the same area for a few years in a row, you start seeing it suppress itself, showing up as this sort of limeish green color, and the plants, they just don't really grow very tall. They're emerged, but they stay very short. So that just builds up as the kochia is on the same site.
So is that part of your long-term management strategy?
It's not, I would say at this point, it's not a good one because nothing else grows there either. So
When was this done? I mean, is this new kochia that would have come later?
I think the kochia was present on this site. These plots were sprayed on May 3rd this year.
So there could have been new.
So one important thing to note about kochia is sort of its phenology of emergence. You tend to see kochia as the first species to emerge in the spring, right? So you get this big flush at the very start of the growing season, in some cases even as early as February or March, depending on the weather, right? So it's usually the first species to be there in the spring. But with kochia, I think just due to the genetic diversity, you also see this prolonged emergence periodicity where you can have emergence in subsequent flushes that tend to depend on rainfall events, right? So some of this kochia could have emerged after these herbicides were applied, and we see that frequently all over the place.
This is all just natural seed bank in the ground. It's not planted.
Is Mike here? I'm not sure if it was planted here or not, but I know that there.
Natural.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So
The other thing for Dave too, though, that we have seen, and I'm sure you have too, is that you can kill off a mat of kochia, and then there's what are they called? Green. I don't know. They're just tiny little kochias that
Didn't get hit.
that don't really grow and they didn't get hit, and then they come back to life because they can see the sun.
yeah, we see that all the time, especially if you're doing a burn down.
Especially in a dense canopy.
Yeah, if you have dense patches, or you often see like little seedlings almost hiding beneath the biomass from last year, right? And then they just come and show through after you apply that burn down herbicide. So anyway, this looks like the best choice here, and in my opinion, there are other choices that aren't demoed here. This is actually, a lot of the efficacy I find from this is due to the addition of dicamba here, and I doubt that Farming Smarter has dicamba-resistant kochia just based on what we're seeing in this plot. Okay.
In stripper headed ground where there's a lot of residue, can you see less control with the authority because you're not able to get that down to the, or will it just next precipitation you get washed down and it's all good?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I find that authority does a pretty good job in just washing down. The other thing to note in a stripper header situation is also that I find the additional biomass layer helps to keep in a little bit of moisture in that surface, right? Which also adds to the activation of that herbicide as well.
I think that's why important to put it on in the fall, just before
Yeah, I
freeze.
agree, yeah.
Works better.
Yeah.
So with this, let's head to the front of this experiment over here, and we'll talk a little bit about wheat now. Okay, so what we're looking at here is basically another demo looking at early season weed control in wheat. The way this is set up, you'll see the herbicide treatments listed at the front. You'll see in the front of these plots, wheat seeded, and then in the back, it's the same herbicide but without the wheat, right? So, especially when you're getting farther down to that end, you can see the impact of the crop competition in combination with these herbicides. This is a good point to start. I mean, you can also wander down here and pick out your favorite, but we're almost standing in front of it here, so at least in my mind. So here, again, we're looking at Intruvix with the addition of sulfentrazone as well. I find at least throughout all of our kochia research that we've done, sulfentrazone seems to be like the best thing since sliced bread when it comes to kochia management. So that's definitely one thing to consider. We've published herbicide trials for kochia management in wheat, and that showed that even sulfentrazone alone without a post-emergence herbicide was actually the best and most consistent treatment compared with a whole range of post-emergence herbicides for kochia management as well.
What rates are they going on glyphosate?
Rates for glyphosate, good question. 450 in this case, which would be maybe less than a liter per acre.
And the supply rate?
Pardon?
Intruvix would be full rate and that's
Yeah, I mean, I assume so.
So there's nothing in crop here. This is just.
They're actually in the wheat here. There is an in crop. One of the refines, Mike told me, but now I forget. So you would have seen hardly any activity from the tribenuron in that in crop on the kochia anyway. You will see a little bit of activity from the synthetic auxin, which becomes pretty apparent when we come down to this end of the study here. Okay. So for the sake of time, let's just continue on down this way. We'll go look at the peas as well. One thing that I've noted, you'll see plots here, I think further down here with essentially group 2 mixed with glyphosate, right? Again, the kochia out here, I suspect is resistant to both group 2s and glyphosate. But I've also noted, depending on the group 2 that you're applying, you can see some of the plants still showing susceptibility to that group 2 herbicide. I've noted that especially so in lentil plots, where we're looking at applying solo, for example. So here you can see, this is what I'm talking about, the group 2 mixed with glyphosate. If you look in the back there, it's looking maybe a little bit less than the untreated control, but still quite similar. But you sometimes do see efficacy on individual plants from that group 2 herbicide, which basically means resistance isn't homogeneous throughout the entire population. Here we're just looking at glyphosate alone.
Your mic did stop, so we're gonna have to talk louder.
Okay, so
Encourage people to come closer.
come down to this end. So here we have just glyphosate alone. There was that post-emergence herbicide that was applied late. You do see a little bit of suppression when you are applying glyphosate, but it's not enough, obviously, to provide any level of management when we're talking about glyphosate-resistant kochia. Here you can see the injury. This didn't have a pre-plant, but you can see the injury on the kochia from that post-emergence herbicide that was applied.
How heavy a rate
For which?
for the glyphosate?
For the glyphosate? 450 again. So it's pretty light rate.
So you were not in revenge mode, eh?
You know, with the mechanism of resistance of glyphosate resistance in kochia, it's what we call gene amplification, right? So glyphosate binds to EPSPS. The mechanism of resistance is that we have multiple copies of EPSPS now. So you need more and more glyphosate to fill those binding sites, which means you can have low-level resistance, but quite frequently we're now seeing up to 30 extra copies of EPSPS, meaning 30 times the herbicide rate. It's not going to control it. When we started seeing glyphosate resistance in kochia here in southern Alberta, it was more about 3 to 6 extra copies. Let's look at the peas down here. So Here we're looking at sort of a similar trial, but in peas, focusing on early season weed control. One thing to note here is that just look at the front and the very back. So at the front, you have the herbicides that are labeled here, and then at the very back is the same treatment but without the peas seeded. There's 2 reps in the middle that are randomized, so don't let that confuse you. Just look at the front and the very back. So the very back being without that crop competition. If you do compare between the back and the front, you can see the ability for peas to actually compete with kochia seems to be quite substantial, especially when you're looking down here at some of the checks that wouldn't have as much efficacy on the kochia. So one thing to note, first of all, because peas tend to be quite competitive, a lot of these plots look really good. As far as early season weed control, I would expect that many of these pea plots are going to yield the same. It becomes more apparent actually if we go to the back of this study. So I encourage you to sort of walk around here. We'll go through here, walk around to the back of this study and look at some of those plots. So one thing about kochia and resistant weeds in general, when we're talking about herbicide applications, I mentioned that yield in many of these plots will probably be the same, right? Which might make some people think they can get away with a herbicide that's a bit less expensive, and they probably can in that given year. But the other thing that you need to think about is that long-term weed control, and you don't want kochia plants to be able to grow under the crop canopy and still produce seed, contribute to the seed bank in subsequent years. So that's the other thing to think about, is that when it comes to kochia now, it's not just about crop yield, it's also about keeping that kochia down for your crop next year. Okay, so the herbicide treatments are labeled at the front of each plot here, starting with the untreated check down there with glyphosate, and then several different early season weed control applications as you move down here. Again, there's no crop here, so this is really where you see the impact of that herbicide alone, absent of the crop competition as well. If you look at some of these plots here, you do see very little kochia and extended control in a few of these plots, which I bet are probably authority. I'm right. Yes?
Were the treatments applied once or twice?
I believe that they were just applied once, but I'd have to double check.
What was there?
And then no unplugging, nothing like pulling of weeds, just...
No, it just the herbicides that were applied. Other thing to note in here is that there was no post-emergence herbicide applied either, right? So we're just looking at the impact of that early season weed control application.
And then my last question, sorry. How many years has this trial being done? Is it the first year or...
That's a good question. Maybe Ken has the answer.
This isn't a
What's that?
replicated research trial. These are just demonstration plots.
Okay.
Yeah. But we've done it for a number of years for FMC.
Did Jamie help you?
Yes,
Good.
thank you.
Good job, Jamie.
So again, what I'm picking up throughout these plots, you'll see that there are quite a few different options that would have effective kochia management, especially when you're adding in that crop competition component, right? But even without the crop competition, we are seeing a few herbicides that have really good control and extended control of those kochia populations. Again, that comes back to a question that was asked earlier about authority and potential resistance. We're seeing authority have really good activity on kochia. The question is for how long. Group 14 resistance has not been documented in kochia anywhere in the world to date. Okay?
I have my thoughts about kochia resistance. Could it have come from sublethal doses? I noticed more weeds on our farm since we switched to a high clearance sprayer. Or the booms go like this. With a pull type sprayer, it was low and slow. I think we were more on target. especially hilly land. You watch some of the sprayers come over the hills. So every time you go over that same spot, you ride in the air and you deposit more on one spot than the other spot. And you get a sublethal dose, it goes through it.
Yep, that's a really good point. Especially, so just for resistance in general, resistance can be selected for in multiple different ways. There's multiple different mechanisms that confer herbicide resistance in weeds, right? In some cases, that resistance is selected for better at really higher and effective doses of the herbicide. In general, those would be mostly target site resistance or target site mutations that we're seeing that tend to confer just a really high resistance, but they occur naturally in plant populations in general. It's not caused by the herbicide, but you select for it through recurrent application of that herbicide, right? So there we're seeing like high and effective doses selecting for resistance. On the other hand, you can see selection by sublethal doses as well. And one of the better examples for that is metabolism-based resistance, where essentially you're applying that herbicide, and especially if there's areas of that field that frequently get that low dose, essentially you're selecting for individuals in the population that have a higher metabolism or a higher natural tolerance to essentially degrade that herbicide, right? And over time, you'll see those individuals surviving in the population year after year, and you're selecting for individuals that have a higher rate of metabolism. Okay, so it can be caused by both sublethal doses and really effective doses, which unfortunately makes things difficult. An example of metabolism-based resistance is group 1 and 2 resistance in wild oat. We actually see both target site and metabolism-based resistance. As far as kochia, we don't know of a metabolism-based resistance to date, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, especially potentially with those synthetic auxins, where we haven't actually confirmed all of the mechanisms of resistance.
Thank you, Charles. And after a big round of applause for Charles, we can get back on and go for lunch.
All right, thanks everyone. I'll be around for lunch if you have any other burning questions.